In this class, we're going to study Lesson 2 in Latin Reading 1. We're going to study John chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. In our last two classes, in the first class, we walked through the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John. We talked about how to read Latin correctly, how to pronounce Latin correctly. And then we went through the translation. In the second class, we took some time to look at the words a little bit. We talked about prepositions and how they relate to nouns. We looked at the verbs and just started to learn some helpful information about the Latin language. In this class, we're going to move on to the second lesson, to the second reading in this class. We'll go through the whole reading. We'll translate the whole reading. And we'll also make sure to pay attention and practice some pronunciation. So we're going to be studying the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. So let's get our notes ready for this class. The class name is Latin Reading 1. And this is Lesson 2. Even though it's class number 3, it's Lesson 2. And the subject of our study is the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. Let's just review quickly some basic rules about pronunciation. We learned in our first lesson that there are 2 different kinds of pronunciation. There's classical pronunciation and there's ecclesiastical. Classical has to do with the actual pronunciation of the language as it was pronounced by the ancient Roman people. So Julius Caesar, Virgil, Cicero, Horace, Ovid, all of the ancient Roman authors, all of the ancient Roman speakers, they spoke the Latin language with classical pronunciation. When we talk about ecclesiastical Latin, we're talking about Christians, and even more generally, Europeans. People throughout Europe who changed the pronunciation from its original classical. When we talked about classical pronunciation, we said every letter has one sound. One letter, one sound. Very simple phonics. The vowels are pronounced a, e, o, and u. They are never pronounced in any other way. It's always the same. And we learned that the letters ke and ge are always pronounced with their hard sounds. Classical Latin, very clear, very simple. All right? Anytime we read the writings of Romans, we read it with classical pronunciation. When we come to ecclesiastical pronunciation, that is the Latin as it's pronounced in the church. I said anytime you read a Christian prayer, anytime you read or sing a Christian hymn that's in Latin, anytime you read a Christian author who writes in Latin, you read with ecclesiastical pronunciation. We saw that the diphthongs in ecclesiastical the diphthongs I and oi in classical Latin are changed in their pronunciation so they sound just like the vowel e. So I becomes e, like celum. And oi becomes e, like pena. poena, pena. That's one important change. We also learned that the consonants ke and ge before the sounds of e and e are pronounced like che and je. And really, those are the changes of ecclesiastical Latin. It's not that complicated. People make way more of a fuss about it than it really deserves. It's not a big deal. And we're not dealing with living languages. The primary reason we're studying Latin is for the sake of reading and interpretation. And anything that you have to say or sing in church, you're going to hear other people saying it and singing it, and it's not that complicated. Okay? So some basic changes. The diphthongs, I and oi, change their sound and are pronounced like e. And the consonants ke and ge, when they come before the sounds e and e, they're spoken with soft sounds, che and je. All right? So those are the basic changes of ecclesiastical Latin. Okay? So let's look at our reading, John chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. And the first thing we'll do is we'll simply read through the reading together. I'll leave this up on the board here, so if you're taking notes, you can keep copying. I'm just going to read through verses 6 through 10 to practice good ecclesiastical pronunciation. All right? So just listen, follow along, read the words as I read them, and pay attention to pronunciation. This is ecclesiastical pronunciation. I'll read it through carefully in ecclesiastical pronunciation, and then we'll read it through it with classical pronunciation just for the sake of practice. So let's read John chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. Follow along and listen to the pronunciation. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus adeo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. Verse 10. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non coniovit. That was a reading of verses 6 through 10 with ecclesiastical pronunciation. And let's just look at a couple important notes. In verse 7, the second word in verse 7 is venit. Venit, pronounced with a V. Venit. If we look to verse 9, in verse 9, we see the word quae, Q-U-A-E in English letters. Quae. And we see the ecclesiastical pronunciation of that diphthong a-e is pronounced just like e. Quae. That's an example of the diphthong. And in the last word of the reading, at the end of verse 10, we see the consonants ge and n together. And when we see the consonants ge and n together, we read it with the sound nya, nya. So we don't say kognovit, we say konyovit, konyovit, like lasagna, right? If you think about lasagna, it's spelled like lasagna, but it's pronounced lasagna. That Italian pronunciation is present in ecclesiastical pronunciation, so konyovit. Now, just for the sake of practice, let's read through this with classical pronunciation. So I'm going to read it as if an ancient Roman was reading it. And you'll see that there's really not much difference. Just a couple points will be different, and it's really not a big deal. Pay attention to the pronunciation of the letter V, the pronunciation of that diphthong in verse 9, and to the last word that we just talked about. So listen to classical Latin and see that it's not much different. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. It's exactly the same as ecclesiastical. Verse 7. Hic venit, there's a difference. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. So in verse 7, there's only one difference, the pronunciation of venit as venit. Verse 8, non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. So in verse 8, there's not a single difference. Verse 9, erat lux vera. There's a difference. Erat lux vera. Quae, there's a difference. Quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. And verse 10, in mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. Cognovit. Okay? That's it. So it's very similar. Very similar. The only difference is the pronunciation of the what we would call the letter V, the pronunciation of the diphthong I, and that last word, cognovit. Cognovit. Okay? That's it. So that's why I say that the fuss people make about pronunciation is really not that big of a deal. So remember, when we read Christian writings, we read them with ecclesiastical pronunciation. But it's important for us to also be learning and practicing classical pronunciation. Classical pronunciation is important in grammar studies because classical pronunciation helps you to easily pronounce words and remember how to spell them. It will help you with spelling more than ecclesiastical pronunciation will. So now that we've read the passage, let's go through and translate it. And remember what I said in our in our first lesson. I said, as we go through the translation live together in class, as we go through it in class, I may say some things that aren't exactly what's written in the exposition. I may add some information that's not in the exposition. This is intended to help you in your studies. But when you take an online quiz, you should study for the quiz using only what's in the written lesson. So if I add something in the live class lesson, if you take that information to the quiz, it might get marked wrong because the quiz isn't intended to handle this. But if you stick to the printed lesson for the quiz, that will help you to avoid any mistakes. So I'll talk more in the class than there is in the printed lesson. But when you study for the quiz, study the printed lesson. Okay, so let's read together and translate verses 6 through 10. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus adeo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Fuit is a verb, there was. Homo, a man. Missus, sent. A, from or by. Deo, God. There was a man sent from God. Fuit homo missus a Deo. Cui, for whom. Nomen, the name. Erat, was. Ioannes, John. There was a man sent from God for whom the name was John. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Hic. Hic can mean this man, or it can mean the same. It's a pronoun. It refers back to verse 6. It refers back to the noun Ioannes. Or we could say it refers back to homo, a man. Hic, this what? This man John. Hic venit, that means came. This man came in testimonium. And here's an example of something that I'd like to talk about just for a second. In our last lesson, we talked about prepositions. In our last lesson, we talked about how prepositions can have different meanings. In verse 1, we saw the phrase in principio. We saw the phrase in principio. Even though I know you haven't necessarily studied the grammar yet, I explained to you that this is a preposition. This is a substantive noun. This preposition, when joined with the ablative case, expresses the idea of in or on. So in principio is translated in the beginning. In plus the ablative case. We have a substantive noun in the ablative case. Here in verse 7, we see something different. We see the same preposition in, but we see it combined with a noun that's in a different case. This noun is not in the ablative case. This noun is in the accusative case. And when the preposition in is used with an accusative, it has a different meaning. It doesn't mean in or on. It means into, to, or for. And the phrase in testimonium doesn't mean in a testimony. It means for a testimony. It expresses the purpose of his coming. Okay? So when we read hic venit in testimonium tells us the purpose of his coming. Hic venit, this man came in testimonium, for a testimony. Okay? So you can see what happens when the preposition is followed by a noun with a different case. That's why the translation changes. Hic venit in testimonium. This man came for a testimony. Next we have ut. Ut is a conjunction. It means so that. It expresses the purpose, again, of his coming for a testimony. This man came for a testimony, ut, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give. A testimony he might give de lumine. De lumine. And let's look at this phrase. De lumine is another prepositional phrase. De lumine. If we study the noun lumine, we'll see that this is its ablative ending. De is a preposition. So de plus the ablative has a number of different possible translations. It can mean about, it can be translated of, it can be translated from. So there's a variety of possible translations. The context of what's being said is what tells us which translation will be best. So we have to make a decision about how to interpret the passage so that we can translate it. When people say we don't interpret Scripture, we just translate Scripture, that's false, because you have to make interpretations in order to make translations. And when we see a translation is an interpretation. Okay? Because there are a number of options that a translator can choose from, and he already has to have an idea of what the passage says before he can translate it. All right? So when we come to de lumine, how do we choose which meaning we should use? It's based on what the sentence says. So let's look at the sentence. This man came for a testimony so that a testimony he might give de lumine. Lumine means light. De can mean about, of, or from. So that he might give a testimony from the light. That doesn't sound very good. So that he can give a testimony of the light? Maybe, doesn't sound too good. So that he might give a testimony about the light. Yes, that sounds best. So our understanding of the sentence, of the context, directs our translation. All right? We can't translate without interpretation. Anyone who says that is just making it up, because you have to make decisions in order to make translations. The rest of verse 7 reads, Ut omnes crederent per illum. Ut, again, so that. It expresses another purpose. This man came for a testimony, so that a testimony he might give about the light. Why was he giving a testimony about the light? So that, this is his goal, ut omnes crederent per illum, so that all men, omnes, I say men because omnes is masculine and plural. So omnes, the word by itself means all, but because it's masculine and plural, we know that all men is understood. Men is the substantive that omnes refers to. So that all men crederent, crederent means they might believe. So that all men might believe per illum. Per is another preposition followed by an accusative pronoun. Per illum means through him or by him. Hic venit in testimonium. This man came for a testimony, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, so that a testimony he might give about the light. Why? Ut omnes crederent per illum, so that all men might believe through him. Verse 8, non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Non erat ille lux. Non is an adverb. It means not. Non erat ille lux. Not erat. Erat is a verb, means was. Not was ille. Ille is a pronoun. It translates as he. It refers back to John. Non erat ille lux. Not was he lux, the light. Sed ut testimonium, but, sed means but, it's a conjunction. Ut, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give, de lumine, about the light. He was not the light, but he came so that a testimony he might give de lumine, about the light. Verse 9, erat lux vera. Now, erat can be translated he was or it was. And so we have to make a decision. What is this verb referring to? Who is the subject, or what is the subject of this verb? If it's he was, is that referring to John? If it's it was, is it referring to the light? So we have to make a decision, because erat can be he was or it was, and we're talking about two different nouns in this passage. We're talking about John, and we're talking about the light. And we just read, John was not the light. And here in verse 9 we read, erat lux vera. So either he was lux vera, lux means light, vera means true. He was the true light. Who, John? Was John the true light? No. So it must be translated it and refer back to the light, right? It was the true light. Erat lux vera. It was the true light. So this is not talking about John. This is talking about the light that John came to give a testimony about. It was lux vera, the light true, the true light. Que, which, que refers to light, which illuminates or enlightens, omnem hominem. Omnem means every, hominem means man, every man, venientem, coming, in mundum, into mundum, the world. It was the true light which illuminates every man coming into the world. And again, we have an interpretation decision to make. It was the true light which illuminates every man coming into the world. Does that mean the true light was coming into the world, which illuminates every man? Is that what the sentence says? It was the true light coming into the world. Or is this saying, it was the true light which illuminates every man coming into the world? We have to decide. Does venientem refer to the true light coming or to every man coming? omnem hominem venientem, every man coming, or lux vera, was the true light coming? So we have to make a decision in interpretation. In our next class, we'll go more into the detail and look at all these different words and things like that. But I want you to see that there are questions that need to be answered when we translate. It's not simple, necessarily. Verse 10, in mundo erat, in mundo, in the world. Notice the difference in the translation between in mundum and in mundo. You have back-to-back these two phrases. At the end of verse 9, we have in mundum. At the beginning of verse 10, we have in mundo. Same preposition, different cases, and we'll see that the same preposition with different cases gives us two different translations. In mundum was translated as into the world. In mundo is going to be translated in the world. This is in plus an accusative case. This is in plus the ablative case. The accusative is translated into. The ablative phrase is translated in. So you can see how when the case changes, the translation changes. You see that? In plus the ablative has an idea of being present in a place. In plus the accusative has an idea of motion. Again, we'll get into these details more in our second class on this reading. But you can see there a good example, right next to each other, two prepositional phrases where two different cases causes two different translations. So verse 10, in mundo erat, in the world he was or it was. And we have to ask the question, is that referring to John? In the world John was, or in the world the light was? You see, it's not clear. We have to make that decision when we translate based on what the rest of the passage says. In mundo erat, in the world he or it was. Et mundus per ipsum factus est. Et is a conjunction, means and. Mundus, and the world. Per ipsum. We have another prepositional phrase. Per is a preposition. We saw it before in verse 7. Per means through or by. And the world per ipsum. And the world by himself. Ipsum means himself. Note the difference between per illum, by him or through him, and per ipsum, by or through himself. Two different pronouns. Factus est. Factus means made. It's an example of a participle. And est is a verb that means is. So, in mundo erat, in the world, he or it was. Et mundus, and the world, per ipsum, by him, factus est, made is. And whenever we use pronouns, the problem with pronouns is that we have to know who they're referring to or what they're referring to, because pronouns are used in place of nouns. So when we see per ipsum, through himself, we have to ask, who is the himself? Who is the person or thing represented by the pronoun? Factus est, made is. And then to finish verse 10, we read, et mundus eum non cognovit. And the world, eum, him, non, not, cognovit. Cognovit is a verb that means did know. The world, him, not, did know. So let me give the full translation here, just so you have the idea of the passage in your head. And you can compare our word for word with translation with the translation that you read in a Catholic Bible, like the Douay-Rheims Bible or the New American Bible. And you can think about what the differences are. If you see that our word for word translation in Latin class isn't exactly the same as the Douay-Rheims Bible, that gives you an interesting thing to think about. Why are they different? How are they different? And if you look at a modern Bible like the New American Bible, and you see that our Latin class translation isn't exactly the same as the New American Bible, you can ask yourself, why are there differences? Why is the New American Bible different from our Latin class translation? So here's the translation. There was a man sent from God for whom the name was John. This came for a testimony, so that a testimony he might give about the light, so that all men might believe through him. Verse 8. Not was he the light, but that a testimony he might give about the light. Verse 9. He or it was the true light, which illuminates every man coming into the world. Verse 10. In the world he or it was, and the world by or through him made is, and the world him not did know. Where are we at time-wise?
37 minutes.
Oh, 37 minutes. We're doing great. Okay? So that's our translation of verses 6 through 10. Like I said, we'll take another class meeting to go through this and talk about the vocabulary and the grammar in more detail. I don't want to do that in this video because I'd like to be able to take my time. So we have a full reading of the text. We've practiced reading with Ecclesiastical Pronunciation. We also did a little practice with classical pronunciation, which you should always work with just so you become familiar with it. We went through the translation of this entire passage word by word. I made a few notes about the vocabulary, a few notes about grammar, but in our next class we'll go into that in a lot more detail. And then I remember that I said that when you study for the quiz, I intend for this class translation to be helpful, and I add some comments and notes. But when you study for the quiz, stick to the printed lesson, because the exposition in the printed lesson, that's where the quiz comes from. The quiz is looking for the answers that are there in the exposition. So study the exposition to prepare for the quiz. One last thing I want to talk about since we have a few minutes. Word order. You'll notice that when we read Latin, we haven't talked about this yet, and it's important. I'd actually like you to take notes on this a bit. When we read Latin, we'll see that the order of words is different in Latin than it often is in English, and this is important. I want you to think about this with me a little bit. The word order is not the same. Many students, when they translate Latin, what they do first is they try to rearrange the words so that they're in normal English word order. And that may help. But what I want you to learn is to not do that. Don't change the words around, because you don't need to. Don't change the words around. And I just want you to think with me about grammar for a little bit. This is basic English grammar. We said that we said that ideas are represented by words, right? So if here's a man and he's thinking about some ideas, and this is his thought here. He's thinking about an idea. He's got idea 1 and idea 2, idea 3, and he decides to share these ideas in speech. And when he shares the ideas, he represents his ideas with spoken words. And I want you to imagine that you're a boy living in ancient Rome. When a Roman man spoke the word, that word would signify an idea, and you would immediately think about that idea. Do you understand that? So the word order of the language is the order of the ideas that are being communicated. So if we read, in mundo erat, and we think about those words. So if he has the idea of in and the idea of mundo and the idea of erat, and he chooses to speak those ideas with words, and he says, in mundo erat, and you're this boy over here, and you're listening to what he says, and you're thinking, as he speaks, you're thinking, what's the first idea that comes in your mind? In, right? That's first, and then mundo is second, and these would have images associated with them, and then erat, was. So the ideas come into the mind in the order that the words come into the mind. You understand that? When he says in mundo erat, he shares the words in this order, and those words lead to thoughts in that same word order. In mundo erat. The boy thinks of the idea of in, right? We have an idea of in. Then he thinks of the idea of the world. Then he thinks of the idea was. In that order. That's Latin word order, and there's an order of thinking. This is what I want to make sure you understand. So when a Roman heard Latin, his order of ideas was based on the order of the words. And when we see the order of words in Latin, we're seeing the way that the Latins thought, the order in which they shared ideas or had ideas. So learning to read in the word order like this, learning to read the word order and think in the order of ideas is part of what it means to learn Latin. Not only to learn the words of Latin, but also to learn how to think like a Latin speaker would think. Okay? How would you say this in English? What would we say in English? Let's say we had these ideas in our mind. We had in, and we had world, and we had was. He was. How would we share those ideas? What would we say? What would we say in English? How would we, if we wanted to share these three ideas, how would we share them?
In the world he was.
No, that's not how we talk in English.
He was in the world.
He was in the world. In English, we almost always start with the subject. We would say, he was in the world. And you can see we also add these ideas. We also add this idea of the article. In English, it's normal for us to share ideas in a different order. We think in a different order than Romans would have thought. And so our order of ideas wouldn't be the same as that. Our order of ideas would be, he was in the world. We would say, no. Erat needs to go first. There, now that makes sense. Erat in mundo. He was in the world. And that's what students often do. They want to move the words around so the order of ideas is like English. You see that? But you don't need to do that. And you shouldn't do that. Don't move the words around. Translate them and think of the ideas in the order of the words in Latin. So when you study the translation, you don't have to move things around to understand it. And if you avoid understanding it, if you avoid moving things around, you'll actually be able to learn to think with the order of ideas that the original author had. So when this passage, or let's verse 10, in verse 10, the author writes, in, and that's the first idea. Right? The first idea is in. Then the second idea is mundo. And the third idea is erat. Et, mundus, and the world, per ipsum, by him, factus est, made is. That's not how we speak in English, right? We don't say made is. We say the world was made. We wouldn't say by him the world made is. We would say the world was made by him. Right? But if we read it in the original word order and say, and the world by him made is, that's different than English, but it's perfectly easy to understand. Right? And if you keep everything in the word order that it is, you'll be able to learn to not only read the Latin language, but you'll begin to think like the Latin speakers thought. You'll begin to think with ideas in the order that the Latin speakers thought of those ideas. So you don't need to move words around. You need to learn to get used to thinking in the order of Latin language. All right? In the world he was, and the world by him made is, and the world him not did know. Not English word order, but easy to understand. Right? It's just a different presentation of the ideas, a different ordering of the ideas. But once you let yourself practice that a little bit and get used to that, you won't need to move things around. You'll just get used to it. So when you translate, don't move words around. All right? Just learn to read a word, translate. Read a word, translate. Read a word, translate. And then think of the translation in the original word order. And you'll begin to have more of an understanding of the Latin language and not just be treating it like English. Okay? So let's not only learn to read the words of Latin, let's also learn to think like the Latin speakers. And that will help us to learn the language. So, we've gone through the whole translation of verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. What I'd like you to do now is just take a minute, write a summary of what we've studied in this class, and that will be all for this lesson, lesson 2 on the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. In our next class, we'll look at the vocabulary and grammar of this passage in a little more detail.